Hello class, I hope everyone is doing well today. We're going to talk about civil liberties this week and the importance of the idea of individual rights, which are civil liberties. And when we talked about early constitutional history, one of the things that we went over was the fact that the United States government is really set up in such a way that we have a free society, and so individual rights is a big part of that free society. So if you were going to look somewhere and in the constitutional realm and ask, well, where did this started? How do I know that she's telling me the truth? You would look to the Bill of Rights. As I mentioned earlier in the term, when the ratification process started for the Constitution, there was some concern among states that the federal government didn't have any kind of limitations in regard to what it could do to individual freedoms. And so the Bill of Rights was written to address that by James Madison. It's also important to distinguish between civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties are going to encompass things like freedom of speech, the rights of an individual to worship how he or she chooses. It's going to cover the right to bear arms, those types of things, but those are individual things on an individual level. We're going to get to civil rights next time, and that deals more with groups that have been historically discriminated against in one form or another. So civil liberties, it's all about individual rights. And so let's start with number one. Number one actually covers a lot of ground. The First Amendment actually covers freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, and so there's a lot in it. So the first thing, though, it really covers is religion. And what it does is it states that Congress will make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and it will not prohibit the free exercise thereof. So what the Supreme Court has done is it says there's basically two clauses there. One is that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and it's not going to prohibit the free exercise thereof. So the Establishment Clause has basically been used to say that Congress really doesn't have a right to do anything to regulate religion, and it's also been used to insinuate that this was really not a government put together that was ever meant to have one particular religion imposed upon people. And that definitely is true if you look at the free exercise thereof clause. The free exercise clause is one that essentially has been interpreted to mean that, as long as you're doing what you want to religiously and you're not hurting anybody, you're allowed to exercise your religion. And it's important that you have that protection. In other words, if you do harm to somebody in the name of your religious beliefs, then the government can step in and charge you with crimes. I'll give you a few examples. We have had in recent years groups in the American Southwest that have ingested a tea that actually has a hallucinogen in it that comes from like the Amazon River Basin, and it's something that was considered to be an illegal substance. Well, the group was charged with having illegal substances, and they took it to court, and they made the argument that they have a religion that is a mixture of Christianity and Native American beliefs, and that it's very common in the Native American tradition to use hallucinogens in religious ceremonies. And the Supreme Court actually sided with the religious group, arguing that, if it is something that's established and that's what you're doing for a religious reason, you can do that. We also have had cases where a lot of states have had to outlaw things like using poisonous snakes in religious ceremonies, because poisonous snakes in most states have certain laws that regulate and control them for the safety of all of us. And so you may have somebody who says, well, but if that's my religious belief, I can use that. Well, then the question is, though, by using something that's poisonous and potentially dangerous to people, are you putting people in harm's way? And, that's really the line that's used when dealing with freedom of religion. You have the right to do what you want to do, but at the same time, too, you're not allowed to put other people in danger. There's many, many different interesting court cases that touch upon religious freedoms, and so it's the age of information. Feel free to explore it. Now, the other thing looking at that, we also have Congress cannot abridge the freedom of speech. Please know that this means that if you say something that is, negative about a political official, for example, you do have a right to say that without having to worry about getting arrested or being fined. We do have limitations on freedom of speech, though, because it's very important to note that freedom of speech is something that's protected by the government In other words, if I were to say something, that was, a little bit politically, motivated and angry, and I just said it, but I didn't threaten anybody, the police couldn't come and arrest me. At the same time, too, it's important to point out, especially in this day and age, let's say I put something up on social media or somebody heard me say something and they said, that's really hateful, or, that really has no place in a workplace or in society. There are people who lose their jobs every day for putting something out there that's considered to be offensive. And it's not really what the First Amendment was meant to protect. The First Amendment is meant to protect you from being treated poorly by the government for saying something. Also, the First Amendment does not protect any kind of threatening speech for obvious reasons. I'm sure many of you have heard the whole, like, if you go into a movie theater and yell fire, you're putting people in danger if there's really not a fire. And so we have limitations on almost all of our freedoms because there's a line where safety can become an issue. And even though you do have individual rights and individual freedoms, you don't necessarily have a right to harm others or to threaten others. Just remember that. It also, of course, is where we have protections for the freedom of the press. Obviously in a democratic society, we do not ever want to get to a point where the government determines what is put out in the press and what is not. Hopefully you all remember from our discussion about the media that the press actually is a major check on government. And so while the press is supposed to print and report things that are true, and sometimes that doesn't happen, many of you may not read newspapers, but once upon a time, if a newspaper accidentally printed something and it turned out to be false, they would print a retraction explaining that they were sorry and how they really thought it was true when they printed it. And of course, that happens kind of in a lot of the 24-hour news networks. Something's reported, and an hour later, it's like, oh, sorry, that information was false. But it is very important to keep the government from really ever regulating the press because, we need something to keep a check on government officials. The First Amendment also gives you the right to peacefully assemble. For those of you familiar with your revolutionary history, you might know that the British got angry after the Boston Tea Party and actually tried to keep the people in Boston from meeting on any regular basis. And so this was probably one of the many things that inspired the idea that you do have a right to go and gather in groups of like-minded people. Now, of course, you don't have a right to go and start planning an overthrow of the government because then you're moving into something called sedition. But if you're getting together and you have a cause, you want to discuss it with people, then you have the right to do that. And let me point out too that if you do this, it's also now protected for groups that you might join. In the 1950s, there was a case where the NAACP had a problem because a lot of people were threatening, for example, people who joined it. And, if you had somebody who was coming to work and was told, you're fired because I found out you were in this organization. The Supreme Court actually ruled that that is also protected under the freedom to assemble. And, quite frankly, most people are just assembling online together in groups and stuff now. So, we might not all meet up at, town hall, once or twice a week for group meetings anymore. But I think the nature of the amendment still stands true today. Now, it also guarantees the right to petition the government for redress and grievances. We do have the right to petition our government. This can be done in a number of ways. It can be done by trying to put referendums on ballots. If you've ever been asked, for example, to sign a petition to do that, you do have a right to publicly push for things, to go directly to the voters. And you obviously have a right to petition in front of government buildings. You do have a right to write out a sign, get in front of a courthouse and carry it around and to say I'm upset about this law, or I don't think this is right. And these are things that you can do without fear of getting arrested. Now, of course, there are some limitations on that too. If you are, for example, blocking doorways of government buildings, then you could get arrested for that, because even though you can claim, well, I'm upset, I have my grievance, you don't have a right to disrupt other people's work days. So just something to keep in mind. Speaking of that, I'm going to briefly talk about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is one that is somewhat controversial because of its wording. The Second Amendment states that, making sure I get it all right, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This has been interpreted by many different people, many different ways, and I'm sure that for those of you watching this, you might have your own interpretation, and if you got into a discussion with somebody next to you, it might not be the same. Now, some people have pointed out that a well-regulated militia, this is the only amendment that actually starts with something other than just the freedom itself. So some people have argued that the implication here is that, well, well-regulated militia is necessary, so this is why we can't do it. A well-regulated militia today, by the way, would be more along the lines of something like a National Guard. It wouldn't necessarily be, sometimes you hear the word militia and it's not a good group. But the well-regulated part is, that aside, the Supreme Court has ruled in recent years that the amendment does imply the right to having individual ownership over weapons. Of course, with the Second Amendment, though, and even in the Supreme Court's more recent decisions, there has still been an implication that there can be certain restrictions on firearms. And we're kind of going back to some of the stuff we talked about in the First Amendment, and that was that even though you do have certain rights, the question of public safety always comes in as well. And so that oftentimes defines a lot of the debates that we see going on today. Where do you draw the line of, as an individual, having a right to do something, but also trying to secure the safety of people in this country? The Third Amendment, and I'm going to really quickly read it to you, it says, "No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house," in case you were worried about it, "without the consent of owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." For those of you familiar with the American Revolution, you might know that some soldiers were quartered, and communities had to, prior to the war, pay for their housing and for their food. This is one that is probably a little bit dated, but it definitely at the time would have probably seemed to be necessary, sort of that individual guarantee. So I'm going to stop the video right now, and then we're going to pick up with a part 2 for civil liberties. And I'm going to start with the Fourth Amendment because there's quite a bit between the Fourth and Eighth Amendments that deal with people who are accused of crimes.